Welcome everybody. This module is about language complexity. So by the age of 5, most kids are grammatically competent. They know how to speak and they say some pretty funny stuff still. But interestingly enough, you don't have to be able to speak to learn to read and write in English. Many of my international students have learned to read and write before they learned to speak because of the context and environment in which they were living. So as you can guess, reading with comprehensive input promotes second language acquisition. And reading, writing, listening, and speaking are all interrelated to each other, and it's a complex kind of relationship that supports each other. And according to the social constructivist, interactionist ideas, students have to talk to each other to learn. Learning is a social activity. Think Lev Vygotsky. What can you do to make your students want to talk more? Think about that. What can you do? Here's a sentence that was given to me a few years ago. I don't want to be in a relationship. Depending upon who's speaking to who and all sorts of factors, the translations could be any of the below. Also, depending on the intonation patterns, I don't want to be in a relationship with you. I've never really been into the idea of having relationships. Or, you know, maybe I've been through a terrible relationship and I'm never going to have another one. So it's interesting that language can be translated into so many different ways. So especially when we're dealing with English language learners, we have to be very careful and very precise in our speaking. And we have to be explicit and model and repeat and clarify, do all kinds of things to support our learners. Figurative language is one of the things that can trip you up. Give me your heart, I need a heart transplant, versus give me your heart, I love you so much. There are 2 videos on Brightspace for you to look over. Some classroom activities to promote interactions. Remember that question I asked you just a minute ago? You could do paired readings. You know, you could do readings where one person has a text with some missing words, and the other person sitting back to back has the same text with the words, and then that person's text is missing words so that they have to help each other read. You can do grouping where people do research together, learning together, brainstorming in small groups, brainstorming in pairs. You can talk the news, you can have kids video the news, act out the news, and then active listening. Again, let me give you a plug for Jim Knight, Better Conversations, great book on learning to listen. Here's something for you to read in terms of listening. That's pretty interesting. Just how good is your listening? A little bit more on listening. And again, plug for Jim Knight, Better Conversations. My pet peeve, teacher talk. Talk, 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 talk. We are always direct instructors, talking too much, explaining too much, telling too much. Cut the teacher talk. The power of words. There's a YouTube video for you to look over. Something about language etiquette. This is more into discourse analysis. It's a really, really good book by Scott Thornbury if you're interested in discourse analysis for language teachers. Thornbury, Scott Thornbury. So now I'd like you to reflect. Reflect a little bit on how the social context impacts speaking and language forms. So think about the social setting, the power relationships. Think about the parameters of politeness and formality, about turn taking, about the register you speak in. What's the difference when you're speaking to a little old lady in a hospital room who's dying, who might be a relative of yours, versus the way you speak in a discotheque when you're trying to get somebody to pay attention to you? What's the difference between classroom etiquette and cafeteria etiquette? What's the difference between speaking to a small child or speaking to a elderly person on a bus who doesn't understand English well? Context. Everything is about context. Talking takes effort. It's not easy. There are a couple of videos that I'm going to put in Brightspace for you if you're interested on that. Here are the oral language functions by M.A.K. Halliday, the reasons that we speak and communicate. And pretty interesting to think about, what do you use the most in terms of a function? So what is the difference between beginners and intermediate literacy practices? Beginners, here's how we support them. And beginners, it doesn't necessarily mean beginners in terms of age. It could be beginners in terms of proficiency as well. And let's look at the intermediates. They have the basic interpersonal communication skills. Especially if they're teens, they don't like to be overcorrected. And it's same for adults. I've seen the same in adults, that are intermediates. They show a lot of interest in stuff. They're curious, and you have to be really good model for grammar, as well as good sentence frames, structure, not too much, not too little. How do you like this picture? Are there 3 or 4? Our cultural perceptions really fool us into believing things about reality that may not be the same reality for other people. I can tell you about cultural perceptions and medical stuff, some personal anecdotes in terms of Mongolian medical practices versus Western medical practices. What is sickness? What is disease? I don't know if you all know Lily Wong Fillmore. She is an amazing woman. She's in her 80s now. She was a bilingual advocate and one of the first people to start supporting English language learners. She's Chinese American. My dissertation chair worked under Lily. And Lily has a video that came out of maybe 10 years ago about the kids in New York City learning the stages of a butterfly's metamorphosis, and she was teaching academic content language using a process called juicy sentences. That's Lily's idea. So what kind of strategies promote language development? These are, some of them are, you'll recognize again in SIOP: comprehensible input, output, social interactions, maintaining routines with content changing, a lot of games. And I don't mean games as cutesy pie games, I mean learning games, vocabulary games, sentence games, paragraphs using sentence scrambles, things like that. Very productive types of games. Some other interactive activities that you can use, these are for learning language and learning intonation patterns, learning pragmatics of speaking and discourse. So we all know that when we're teaching content areas, there's unique vocabulary, especially in science and math and social studies. There's unique discourse. There's the passive constructions. There's the conditionals. Words that mean something in regular language mean something different in content-specific language. That has to be explicitly taught. So here's an activity for you. What I'm going to do is read something to you that is colloquial, and then I want you to think in your mind. You don't have to do anything on paper, but just think in your mind, how would you transform this passage into academic language? So here goes. Travel is really fun because you can see how people in other parts of the world live. Often travelers don't think about anything before traveling, and they don't think about how other cultures get themselves clean. Bathrooms in many countries may be super weird. In the U.S., most people take a shower once a day in the morning. There's a thing on the wall and it cannot be moved. The person simply stands under the water, gets wet, uses soap and some kind of a cloth, and then gets dry. Children often take a bath each night and enjoy playing with small toys. Many adults, especially women, enjoy a bath to chill out at the end of the day. It's important to remember that when you take a shower or a bath in the U.S., you should be careful to keep the water inside the bathtub or the shower. Many countries don't have drains. Water can get really messy and get all over the floor. It can also wreck the floor, trash the floor. So be careful. So how would you turn that into an academic passage? Yes, and one of the first things you would do is take away all the colloquial language, take away the dead adverbs like really, change some sentences, change some structures, maybe have clearer definitions of what's going on. Yep. Okay. So scientific language. The language of science has a certain setup, and there it is. It's the language of scientific inquiry, where you formulate a question, a research question, and you state a hypothesis, you record your observations, you analyze your data, maybe you make conclusions and then state limitations. So all of that is part of the discourse of scientific language. It has to be explicitly taught. Social studies also has explicit language. It's a content that's very dense often and complicated. And science can be quantitative or qualitative or mixed. Social studies is often qualitative. It requires intellectual skills and a lot of musing and pondering and organizing of information and coding and trying to find themes and codes. Social studies can have civic values and political implications. You have to also define a topic clearly, gather the information, conduct interviews, do research, come to conclusions. So again, when we facilitate oral language development during instruction, we want to find out what our children or students already know and build on that prior knowledge. We want to identify, review, and model important concepts. You can pre-teach or front-load vocabulary. Visuals are extremely important for English language learners. You can preview the concepts and review again. There's nothing wrong with repetition. Highlight or bold the important words and ideas, and model and check for understanding. So before I go away, there's one thing down here. I hope you can read it. The YouTube that I hope you get to see. And see you all next time. Bye for now.